Hey everybody, welcome and good evening. Welcome to our session 5 of our Lenten study, Soul Reset. And folks have been checking in and we can see that flow on our chat window, and it's really great to have so many here connected with us tonight. So glad to be with you. I'm particularly glad in these days to be able to say it's good to connect with each other as we are so aware. We're in the midst of a great struggle as really a global people, and I know we're feeling that even close to home in our own homes and among our own families, and certainly our community and our church family. And so, really good to be together. There's always some technical challenges tonight for whatever reason, and I ran out of time to really troubleshoot it. Our chat feature can only bring up what's called the default YouTube chat. Oftentimes I do a little overlay, and that gives it a little nicer look and makes it a little bit easier to see a little larger font. So tonight we're just having to go with what we got. So hopefully it's going to work okay, and that you can see it and follow it along. If you're seeing it in full screen, obviously you can't access the chat. You can just watch, which is perfectly fine. If you take it back off of full screen, if you're watching it on the phone, you'd put it this way instead of like this. And if you're with your computer, of course, you have the option down, I think it's in that right-hand corner, to select full screen or quarter screen. And in that way you can access the chat. So just kind of figure out what works for you, and hopefully you can see it and hear it, and we'll get going. Got some folks still checking in. Great to see some folks who maybe haven't been with us at least live in a while, so that's really great. It makes it always more fun and interesting, I think, to join together and to share in that chat feature. So thank you for doing that. Just a couple other housekeeping matters, and then we'll get underway. One of the other things that's, of course, obvious to you, I'm sure, is that I'm broadcasting from a different place. This is the front room of my home, and it's become the recording studio and broadcast studio as we're living through this social distancing situation. So all of what I'm doing and a lot of what our staff is offering as we put that together for worship and so on is coming right out of here. And, again, there's some limitations, but we're doing the best that we can, and appreciate your patience. And again, your participation is what's most important. And so I want to thank you again for that. As we know, we are in the midst of a very challenging time. And as I'm discovering, reading through the material in our study book, it's somewhat, I won't say it's interesting or surprising. It's maybe the way God works. How what we're reading about, and now again here in chapter 5 for tonight, has a connection that can be very powerful for us as we're going through the situation that we're going through. And so I'm glad again to be together so that we can open some of this up tonight. The theme this evening, if you've read through chapter 5, is a heavy one. It's about grief. It's about what grief can do to us, how grief can take hold of us, and how grief can prevent us from being us. And particularly as that relates to our relationship with others, but even more importantly, how that connects and relates to our relationship with God. And so the author helps us, face that, I think, and articulate some of what's behind that and be open and honest about it. And so it's not an easy topic. It's not something that, is light and just, something that doesn't require much of us. It actually, I think, demands quite a bit from us as far as openness goes and willingness. And again, that sense of honesty about, what we're facing and what we're dealing with. So just to lay all that out at the beginning, to say, let's do the best we can. And as you feel able and free to share and both give insight, but also share some of your experience, I think that will be helpful to us. And we know that others are watching a recording of this session. And I forgot to welcome them at the beginning, but we're glad you're here as well. And, they'll be enriched, I think, by what we share and talk about together. All right. Laying all that out, let's share a prayer together. The prayer I'd like to offer is the one that we've used each week. It comes out of the material provided to the leader or facilitator. And invite you where you are to join me in our prayer, and I'll say the words as we begin. Gracious and loving God, you are a God of new beginnings. You created us to be whole, unique, abundant, life-living children. Though we get too busy and disconnected before we even realize it, you are full of grace to offer a reset. You bring us back, refresh our spirits, and make us whole again. As we walk this journey to wholeness, prepare our hearts to let go of what is holding us back. Teach us again what it means to live lightly and freely, walking with you each and every day. Come and be present in our conversation and fellowship. In Jesus' name, amen. That line in the prayer that they give to us, which is inviting God to help us to walk in this journey and to let go of, it says, whatever it is that is holding us back. And I mentioned that the theme of tonight is this weight of grief. And if you read some of the author's story, you know that there was a season of time for Junius Dotson that was absolutely filled with loss. In fact, as I hear his story, and he's going to talk about it a bit in our video clip, it's hard to believe that somebody could really make it through. And it's understandable how difficult it was for him. And so, he's speaking out of experience, and he knows, I guess, of what he says. And so that sense of authenticity from him, I think, is helpful. If you got the book there with you, turn in the book to page 77. I wanted to look at a sentence or so that he writes there on that page and reflect on it with you. 77. Of course, we're in chapter 5. And he's talking about facing these tough times in his life. And right about in the middle of the page, toward the last part of that paragraph, there's a sentence that starts this way. I thought maybe if, and that's where I wanted to start to read and then have you reflect on this with me. He writes, I thought maybe if I powered through and just kept working, I'd find a way to be okay. I thought being a good leader meant stuffing down my pain, stress, and heartbreak. I thought I needed to put on a mask and push through my feelings. That would prove to be a huge mistake, he writes. And so my question, and I noted it here that I wanted to share with you, is what harm does powering through things potentially bring to our spiritual and emotional and physical health when we try to power through? What are the potential consequences of that? And if you've got some thoughts, those of us who are live and chatting tonight, invite you to just put that out there so that we can think about it together. I've had the opportunity, as I thought about that question, to also reflect on it. So I've got some thoughts that I can share as we get started. But of course, I and everyone else wants to know some of what you're thinking. So again, the question is, what is the potential danger, or what is the damage that can come, or what is the impact negatively that is potential there as we try to power through the tough parts of life, and what that could mean then for us spiritually, emotionally, even physically, and just interested in your thoughts about that. One of the things I thought about it is that we can discover that we've been pretending. In other words, it can be as if, up until that point, we think that we've got everything that we need, that we have what it takes, that we are well equipped, to face whatever it is we're facing. And then when we try to power it through, depending upon that image we've got of ourselves, what we realize is we don't. And so that sense of who we are kind of evaporates, in front of us. Some comments coming in. Janine says, we don't fully experience the moment and therefore we avoid the process of healing. So if we're not honest about what's going on, then that may keep the healing out or at bay. Karen says, lots of things happen to us. There's stress. It can impact health and relationship. So again, to try to just do it all ourselves can ramp up what we call stress, and we know how that affects us, not just physically, but in all other ways too. Harry says, tough emotionally to do it alone, and particularly says without God. And I think that is the point, isn't it? That Junius wants to make, and that we'll affirm again together in our time together tonight. Drew says that powering through means that we try to compensate for parts of our being that are currently incomplete, and it usually backfires. So again, there's a sense there. I think you're implying, Drew, and I was trying to touch that too, that there is a dishonesty there. In other words, we're not embracing the real picture about ourselves or about the situation. And as you say, oftentimes the result of that is something that we don't desire or can make it even worse. Debbie says we don't deal with our vulnerabilities, and the longer that we power through and avoid the reality, we eventually realize that we're going to have to deal with it. So what Debbie's saying is, we can approach this in a way that says, I've got it, and yet ultimately we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that we don't have it, that we don't have it all on our own at least, and that we need, I think you're implying here, Debbie, we need others, and we need God especially. Janine says, Liz, right on. Did I miss Liz's comments? I'm going to go back up here and see if I can find. Oh, yes, Liz, body, mind, and soul need time to heal. If you don't take that time to heal, you burn out physically and emotionally. Okay, thank you, Liz. Yeah, so, there's the danger. Everything can kind of just fade away, and everything that we thought we had such a strong hold on isn't there anymore. And then Catherine, welcome Catherine, nice to have you live and with us tonight. She says you power through, and she said she did that years ago and became lost, so we can lose ourselves. And there's again that sense of losing God as well. She talks about being not being honest with God. So there's a sense of drifting, there's a sense of kind of losing our way, as Catherine is saying. So I guess what we could say, not to try to be alarmist and not to try to, frighten any of us. In fact, we're trying to do the opposite here tonight. But what we're saying is there's a lot at stake here. There's the authenticity of who we are. There's the authenticity of who God wants us to be. There's the depth of the reality of relationship with God. All of that is at stake here. How we see ourselves, how others perceive us, and who we truly are in the world. Amita says, better to float down the river, as my dad told me as he passed. So floating in the sense of trusting, right? Instead of trying to paddle it and make it, to just let the water hold us and go with the flow. There's something peaceful that can come to us in that. So appreciate all of those comments. I want to turn to the video tonight because, again, our author, Junius Dotson, will share some of his story. Again, it's really amazing that he had this season of intense loss. I'll let him talk about it, but then we'll come back afterwards and share some of what our perception is of it. So, hey, let's turn to Junius and watch the video. We'll come back and pick up the conversation. Again, glad that you're all here tonight. Appreciate all of the comments thus far, and I know we're going to have a rich discussion together. So let's tune in to the video clip for this evening.
Welcome to week 5 of our Soul Reset journey. I'm so encouraged that groups of people all over the place are gathered together to reset and chart a new course for their spiritual lives. As you begin to live differently, more slowly and focused, more connected to God and less hurried, your very life will become an invitation for others to do the same. Today, I've got some difficult things to share, But in my sharing, I hope you'll discover the power of community and the promise that when the floor drops from under your feet, you will be held by a loving God. I'd like to share with you a message I received from a member of our congregation. This letter came to me in one of the most difficult moments of my life. It read, Pastor Dotson, I read about your mom's passing shortly after you posted about it, and I cried for and with you because I can only begin to imagine the pain you felt. I haven't tried to reach out before now because I wanted to minister in the right way, and words seem so inadequate right after a death. So I've prayed and prayed and prayed some more for you, your brothers, and your families, and prayed that God would just surround you with his arms of love and breathe peace to your spirits in the midst of your hurt. You know, there comes a time in every shepherd's life when he needs to be ministered to. You do so much for us, and a lot of times the congregation tends to take you for granted. I guess they look on you as some sort of Superman who can handle anything. But you know I know better. So just take the time to be JD and not worry about Pastor Dotson. No one and nothing can replace a mother's love. No matter how much they've harped on things and we wish they'd be quiet, to the times we've messed up and they loved us anyway. Your mom raised an amazing dude who is really raising some pretty awesome children of his own, and thus her legacy continues. I hope it helps to know that people all over are thinking of, praying for, and supporting you in this season of your life. And once the busyness of the final arrangements is over, everyone has gone home and is back to business as usual. When you are alone with your thoughts, memories, and you need a friend to listen, know I am never too far away. Then, less than 6 months later, I received this message. Pastor Dotson, so again, I find myself in a place where words fail to do justice to the situation. I walked into church yesterday to the news of your brother's death. I remember you speaking just last week about still dealing with your mom's death and the lessons God has been teaching you through it all. Now this, my heart aches for you. You know everything that should be or can be said at a time like this. You also know that while the sentiment or the intent may be good or even true, it does little in the moment to ease the actual pain. So just know I love you, and I am here if you need me, and I am praying diligently for your family, immediate and extended, as you again walk down the path of sorrow. These are times that try a man's soul. I know you must be feeling like Job, but I pray that, like Job, you can still say, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Friends, as you read this week in chapter 5 of Soul Reset, the year of 2012 was an incredible year of grief for me. Losing my mom, my brother, my grandmother, one of my best friends. And even though I was experiencing tremendous grief, I now know that my community was also experiencing that grief because they were connected to me. That is the power of community. Even when you don't know the words and cannot even imagine what to say, you can give a simple expression of, I'm with you, I'm praying with you, I'm grieving with you. That can be so powerful. What I most appreciated about those messages I received was that it wasn't someone trying to preach me through it or fix it. It was just someone saying to me, I'm here for you. That's the gift of the community of faith. We can be present with one another when we can feel that sense of connection to each other. Sometimes the most powerful gift we can offer is the gift of presence. And the greatest tool we have to offer is the power of prayer. I am learning and growing in my understanding about the importance of community, the ability to grow with others, but also the power community has to help you remember who you are and whose you are in the difficult moments of grief. The gift of community is the ability to be vulnerable with one another so that you can be used by God to help others remember who God is in their life. And the best thing about this type of community is knowing that you don't have to be the therapist or the fixer or the expert. You just have to be the presence of God for another person in their greatest moment of need. That's the beauty of it. That's kind of where Job was when he had lost it all and was in the midst of deep, deep, deep grief. The most meaningful part of the story is when his friends came. They didn't say a word. They were just present with him. No words. A gift we can give ourselves is the ability to be ourselves in the midst of grief. To not pretend that we have it all together, to not put a timetable on our grief, but to know that God heals in God's time. And that's okay. To know that as you are moving through the grieving process, there are people who know you and support you every step of the way. That type of community starts in moments like these, when you're studying the Word of God and sharing from your hearts, when you're growing closer to God and closer to each other, when you're discovering the promises of God's Word. This lays the foundation for those times when you'll simply have to stand on those promises and know that, as Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Sometimes life is going to feel devastating, but we can trust God together. I pray that this session is another one of those foundation building opportunities for you to build authentic community.
All right, Junius Dotson. Pretty dramatic, those letters that he read, and really gets, I think, into the depth of both what he was experiencing, but the beauty of what was offered to him through some folks who knew him well and cared about him so deeply. And so I think, in the mix of that, both what he was experiencing, what they were offering, and what came out of that, we would say, is, the healing that happens when we become open to it and the way in which God can work in our relationships with each other. Yeah, I wanted to pose a question. While that was playing, I was thinking about the way in which grief impacts us sometimes. And here's the question. I want to put it out there on the chat window. And the question is, why does grief sometimes at least feel this way, that it's pulling the rug out from under us? What is it about grieving that can be so disconcerting to us and can, in a sense, turn our world upside down? And I know that's not an easy question, and I know there's not an easy answer to it, if there's any answer at all. But I was just trying to get a feel and any insight that you might have as to what, why that happens, what it is that grief does to us, or what it brings to us, the thing that how it impacts us and alters us, if you will, and just the reality of that and the result of that. As you're thinking about that, some things that I had in my mind when I was thinking about that question is that I think there's an assumption that we have often that if I'm doing things the right way, if I'm, behaving myself, first of all, if I'm thinking of how I look in God's eyes, and if I'm being faithful, I'm making all the right decisions, then what should come is blessing and goodness. And so when that doesn't happen, then it just kind of turns everything upside down for me or us, because we've got a different assumption about what the result of life is going to be for us. Harry says we're generally just unprepared for it. for the loss and for that weight of the grief that comes to us. Kay says for her there's grief itself, and then there's the other things that come with it. Those preparations or new normal, so to speak. It's rarely just the grief that hits us. So it's that whole change of whatever it is that's happened, and usually it's some sense of loss, and significantly so, and how that reshapes our world sometimes instantly and often or almost always when we don't seek it or want it. Sandy says we can't control anything about the situation or the feelings. So it's like this overwhelming, it's almost sometimes described as a wave, that crashes in on us, and sometimes described, I think I've used the word already tonight, a weight that is on us. Amita says lost of a relationship, can't call or communicate with a loved one. So again, thinking of the loss or a death and the grief that brings, because there's an emptiness there, right? And I think we understand what we mean by that and what that can feel like. Brian says there with Sandy that because we are not prepared for the hole that's in our lives. I was just talking about that emptiness. Brian, it sounds like you and I are on the same wavelength with that there's a space that used to be whatever that was that's now lost. And often that's a person or a relationship or a significant person in our lives. Drew says just barely keeping all the stress in our life balanced, and then grief tips it. So in other words, life can be hard, right? Just in its routine kind of way. And then boom, this heaviness of whatever it is that's happened, as you say, Drew, can kind of push us or tip us over that edge. And Debbie says we're trying to figure out what our lives without that person will be like, and additionally the responsibilities that we take on, the strong feelings that we, can we handle it? So again, all of those realities of how life changes. Carol says grief and the circumstances that have caused to take our control away, we don't know how to react. And isn't that part of the issue too? We want to be in control. And often the way that we make decisions and move through life is to maintain control. And what grief does is it can spin us out of control. And therefore it's not our friend. We have a feeling about it. Grieving, Karen says, requires time and a process of adjusting. It's a lengthy process and can take time to get through it. And we're an impatient people, quite frankly. So we don't want to take the time. We want it back together and fixed and over with and done and moving on now. So often, Catherine says, lose the ones you love. You feel never that you can't even live again without them. There's just, again, everything's different. And not only do we not do well with change, but something that feels to be permanently changed for us. And again, if it's unwarranted and unwanted and something that's very important to us that we've lost, that kind of change, then it's that kind of situation that Catherine's talking about. And Sandy says the whole can be a job loss. Yeah, we're talking about, most of our comments I think are relating to a person that we've lost, and though that is perhaps one of the most significant experiences, but it can be other ways of loss that come to us. Job loss is one. In fact, we can mention it now, and I think we'll talk about it perhaps a little bit later as we move into the session tonight, that what we are experiencing as a culture, community, a people, a nation, a world, in my feeling, has an element of grief in it. And I was talking to one of my work colleagues today, one of the staff members from the church, about this today. And I found myself saying that I'm identifying, both in myself, but I think I feel it in others too, just this sense of what we are losing or what we have lost in this pandemic and our need to respond the way that we are to prevent more people from becoming seriously ill. And I mean, that's the goal, which is noble and good, and everybody wants that. And at the same time, we realize all that is lost, both by what the virus is taking away as these deaths mount, but also just our way of life, our routine, So there's some grieving going on. And I think it may be important for us to identify that, to articulate it, and to be able to be honest about that. And there's a darkness in that for us, and we're kind of right in the midst of it. Reuben says the grief, it usually takes over, it overwhelms us. And we want to feel those positive things that, we want to be whistling a happy tune. And, here it is. And so, what do we do with that? Kay's agreeing with Sandy that those losses, those holes. And Janine says it feels like something devastating's happened. It shuts down. So, this is real stuff we're talking about. And Junius, through his experience, and imagine that, a mother, a brother, a good friend, all in that short period of time, what that did for him. And he already said to us in his earlier writing that he is prone to depression. And so these losses just mounted up in a way that left him, really just a kind of a shell of the person that he knew he could be and that God wanted him to be. So this is why he relates his own personal story to the story of Job in the Bible. Now, it's impossible to tackle the story of Job in these brief minutes together tonight or in one chapter of a book. So we're not going to try to do that. And I think that's why he doesn't really refer to many passages in Job. He picks out that one verse, but it's really the whole story of Job. And the story of Job is ultimately about loss and about trying to understand what has happened or is happening and where God is in the midst of that. And so ultimately it's a story about relationship with God. And what we could say is that the story of Job, like all of the Bible in one way or another, becomes grounded in the experience of faith, what faith is, what true faith is. And so all of that's wrapped up in the story of Job. And, we won't go, again, through the details of the story. I'm hoping that most of you, if not all of us, know enough about the Job story, to be able to start reflecting on that again. I do see another comment came in from Drew while I was rattling on there. And Drew says that the pandemic situations cause us to realize how much we've let lives focus on doing things instead of strengthening relationships, right? I mean, there's some of the opportunity that's in the midst of this that we can reprioritize and recenter life perhaps on what really matters. But in that process, I'm just saying it's painful. And I think there's some grieving that we all feel at different layers and different levels of our experience because of what we're going through. One of the questions that we ask, and Job asked it, because he was an upstanding and righteous man, the Bible says. In other words, he was living the way God wanted him to live. He was being the kind of person God wanted him to be. And yet all of this terrible stuff fell upon him. And the question that he asks is why? Now, this may be really hard to cover in a chat window or just in this way of communicating with one another, but I wanted to throw it out there because you guys are wise. You really are. And you might have something you'd like to say about this. And my question is, what makes the question why so critical for us? Why is this happening? Why me? Why is whoever doing this to me, or what's the cause of it? The question of why. I know that's kind of a philosophical question, but it seems to me to be the question that is often on our minds and in our hearts as we are at least initially entering into an experience of grief connected to some kind of deep and significant loss. And the question is, why? What makes that so significant a question for us, such a critical question? Why is the question of why always right there? It seems at the front edge of this experience. Amita says, mystery. Now, that's mysterious that you just put that one word out there, Amita. If you can say a little bit more about what you mean, I think I know what you mean. But could you say some more words about that when you say mystery and how that relates to us wanting to ask the question, why? So I'll give you a moment to think about that. Don't mean to put Amita on the spot, but I thought it was an interesting response. And I'd love to know a little bit more on what she's thinking. Debbie says it's our way of addressing our loss of control. Or maybe, I think what you're implying there, Debbie, is a way of trying to get the control back, right? If I ask why, and if I can have the answers to why, and information is given to me, what we assume is that information brings some control and power, and so that's what I need. I need an answer, because answers become my way to get through this. Karen says, to have a logical explanation is what's happening. We want it to make sense somehow. And Sam says, for starters, we try to make sense of our situation. There it is again. That's the way we tackle issues and problems. Give me the facts, put it together, now I can see, right? So Kelly says, maybe we think we know why it all makes sense. If we know why, then it somehow just living with an unanswerable question is too much for us at times, right? Debbie says, yes, we yearn to understand God better. And Janine says, knowing why makes us feel better, but it doesn't, because we can't control it. We're still not in control. You remind us that God is in control. And Drew says, why? Attempting to try to regain control. There it is again. I think we're seeing that theme in your responses, which I think is helpful and probably clues us in on something. Sandy says, we're rational people. We want to make sense of the situation. We want an explanation. There's got to be a reason. Give us all of that, please. And then once I have that, I'll be able to manage my way. Catherine says, to know why it's happening to us, it gets us that control back. So there's that theme again. Now, Amita says, outside of our understanding, how it relates to our circumstance. That was my question to Amita's first response, which I thought was so interesting. It's a mystery. So the very nature of it, perhaps, why, is not ours to know. It's beyond the realm or the boundary of what we can know, touch, feel, make sense of, even understand, right? And so part of the question, I think, of us dealing with loss and grief and all of the things that the author writes about this week is, do we have the capacity to live with questions like why, questions that cannot be answered? I'm going to throw this out there only because years ago in my pastoral ministry, I came across what I thought ended up being a very helpful piece of, I'll call it wisdom. I wish I could tell you who said it, where I read it, the source, but I do not know. But I've never forgotten it. And some of you maybe have heard me say this in classes or Bible studies. Faith is not that which gives us the answers. Faith is what allows us to live with the questions. I'll let you think about that as I say it again. Faith is not that which gives us the answers. Faith is that which helps us live with the questions. And I've always felt that to be significant and worthy of my thought, and now I share it with you for your thinking as to what that might mean. Janine had said, there are some people who think that the coronavirus is God's way of punishing us, which is absurd. Yeah, so there's a case in point of trying to answer the question, why? And, does faith give us that kind of answer? Many would say no. I personally would say no to that. But faith can, and it is, I see evidence of this everywhere, helping us to remain strong, helping us to refocus, helping us to sense new priority, helping us actually to grow spiritually in our faith in the midst of So it's not why is this happening, but it's not that God has caused it, but God is and working through it in order to deepen our own relationship with each other and with God. So, yeah, helpful thoughts there. Mike's wife Marilee said to him, not as she was dealing with the cancer, that he reflected on her good life. Yeah. So Marilee was a dear soul. We miss her deeply, Mike, and thanks for sharing that. Janine says, "Can you type it, please?" Oh, you want me to type what I said? Okay, let's see. Faith, I'll shorten it a little bit, does not give us the answers. Faith helps us live with the questions. That's sort of what I said. Close enough. There you go. It's always God's time, and it feels like it's not a fast enough answer. Yeah. Sandy says, "Thank you, Mike. Marilee was a woman of great faith." Indeed. Agreed to that. All right. Hey, let's move on. We've got a few more things I wanted to get your input on before we wrap up for tonight. Again, in the book, on page 79 this time, almost right in the center of the page, just about, there's a short little sentence in that paragraph in the center of page 79. He says, as he's referring to all of this experience of loss and so on, and how that was impacting him, he says that the experience was, and this is the phrase I wanted to lift up, and I circled it in my book, a wake-up call. Now, I've heard people refer to things in life as that before, and I might have some thoughts about that, but you might too. And so I thought, let's pool our thinking together tonight. And what does that mean? Or how can an experience similar to what Junius went through, and very much like what we're going through now, and other experiences that we've had in life, how or in what way is that a wake-up call, as we referred to it? What are we trying to say? What does that mean? And, just like to get your input on that. What is a wake-up call? And what does that look like? What does that feel like? How do we know when it's happening in our life and to us? And any thoughts about that? Appreciate hearing that. I've had some, again, as I think about these questions, I have some chance to also, begin to make some response to that. And one of the things that I noted here was that these kinds of experiences wake us up in the sense that, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, and some of you are as well, that it can help us to capture our priorities again. We can lose those for lots of reasons, and so in that way, these experiences that rattle us can actually refocus us on what we believe to be very true and valuable to us in life. Here he says, there's a devotional in our Lenten booklet today. I think you're referring to that, Harry, where Jesus drives the bus and takes over our questions as we deal with grief. Yeah, I read that same devotional. I appreciated that. Jesus being in charge, and how important that is. Janine says it's a significant emotional, physical event, gets our attention. So again, it in a sense kind of grabs us by the shoulders and shakes us and says, "Hey, I know this is rough, this is tough, and yet pay attention." And I think what we'd say in our life of faith, that's God, taking us by the shoulders, saying, "Look, I'm right here. Let's rediscover together what really matters, what really means, what really is true life for you." Amita says, "You're next in line." I'm not quite sure, but maybe that means that there we are, and that we're following the way of Christ. A wake-up call is something that causes us to change course. So the direction of our life becomes new. We reprioritize, as we were saying, and understand the reality that anything can happen to anyone at any time. So it helps us to understand the value of life. And the value of life, quite frankly, involves vulnerability. If life is not vulnerable, then it starts to have less meaning. But because there's a fragile nature to it and a preciousness to it that requires both gentleness and protection, then what's wrapped around it, this life that we share, particularly this life in the faith, is, a real deep blessing. And part of the reason it's a blessing is because it is so precious. It's not, just and no worries, good to go. No, it's more tender, more fragile, more vulnerable. Why? Because it's all about relationship. And, again and again, we keep coming back to that truth. In the book, I'd refer to another place just to check one of the statements from the author. And this time, I think my note says, page 82. Turn there with me and get your impact or your response rather to this. Right in about the middle of the page again, toward the second half of that first full paragraph, he's got a sentence that starts this way: to live an abundant life. And I wanted to read this and then have you think with me about it. To live an abundant life doesn't mean we won't face trouble or storms, or that everything will always be good times, safety, health, and wealth. It just means we have the capacity to deal with things as they come. So that's the author's way of answering the question, what difference does faith make? And one of the things I think feels to me to be significant about what he's writing there is that a life in faith does not magically remove from us trouble, strife, hardship, or vulnerability, right? Friends, we are preparing in just a matter of days to enter into the experience we call Holy Week. And it's holy this week because we journey with Jesus, and that journey ultimately ends with the cross. The cross is a place where all of those assumptions we just named are ripped away. Wealth, health, success, safety, good times. All of the things on that side of the ledger at the cross have fallen away. And so to walk with Jesus, to follow Jesus, as he says to his disciples, pick up your cross and follow me, is not a promise that everything will be good and bright and sunny from here on out. I think it's more what Junius Dotson is pointing to here, that what the faith does, what walking with Christ does, what it means to follow Jesus to the cross does, is it prepares us to not only deal with things as they come, but to move through them and to experience where God is with us in them. And I think that's the kind of a last question I wanted to throw out to get your input, because it's even, I think, a more pointed question than even the question of why. And I appreciate the comments are coming in. I'm just going to let those kind of stand on their own just for a moment. And I want to get this question out, and then we can have more chance to kind of all get in the act on this. But even more important than the question of why is the question of where is God in this? Again, our topic is grief. Our topic is loss and the weight of that. And the question that I ask is, where is God in the midst of that? It's a question that, as some people have asked it, it has cause quite a bit of struggle. And sometimes there's a faith crisis at work there because there are assumptions about God and there are assumptions about where God is or what God should be doing or what God should be preventing in their life from happening, isn't happening. And so that God question, where is God in the midst of all of this, is an important one. It may be way too important to try to put in a chat window, but I'm going to invite you to think about it and to lift up some things. And we all do this in great humility. None of us know the answer exactly, but all of us have a piece of it, I think. And so I would welcome any thought that you have about the God question of this. Where is God in the midst of it? One of the things that I've thought about over my life of faith and ministry is that where God is right in the suffering. In other words, I think of the cross again as the deepest and most profound expression of love. So while we might assume that suffering and loss means God doesn't love us, as we're in the midst of it, and God is with us in the midst of it, it's the expression of God's deepest love for us. There's God lifting us up, God listening to us and holding our hand, says Janine. So it's that presence, not that cancels out all that is so difficult, but in the midst of, that may be one of the most important phrases for us to be thinking about right now. In the midst of all of this, God is there with us. Why? Because of God's love that wraps around us and God's love that is in us and fills us and moves through us. And that says providing the comfort as we accept it. So there's a spiritual embrace of God that makes such a difference in the midst of it. And I think Jesus' experience on the cross is all about that. Debbie says, carries us in our faith, no matter what. There's this feeling of being scared and lost, and yet God is there with us and holding us. The psalmist says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear. You are with me, right? The Apostle Paul says, there is nothing here, nothing there, nothing now or to come or in the past or any other event or experience or power or authority or principality. Nothing, Paul says, can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. And that means not suffering or loss and no amount of grief. None of that can separate us from God. So where is God? God is right there in the middle of it. Sometimes I find comfort in thinking about how some people describe it, that God is crying also, that God feels the loss as well with us. There's a solidarity between us and God, and that matters, right? So appreciate the other comments, both from Mike. Our faith doesn't prevent life events. It allows us to deal with those events. Exactly. And Amita says suffering brings us closer to the Lord. Isn't that something? How suffering can bring people closer. Think about, and we'll pause right there, think about what's happening right now. I mean, in an odd, ironic way, do you not feel closer to some of the people that you're not able to be with because you can't be with them? Think about that. There's this coming together emotionally. There's this longing of the heart that before we maybe weren't even in touch with, that is just right there. So the suffering that we're going through increases the love. That's the way God works. Yeah. Karen says, working through grief can give you an opportunity to heal soul and, again, grow closer to God. And Ruben says, God is our home, providing peace and support. The outside world is unpeaceful and scary, but God is our home. There's that beautiful prayer, ancient prayer, that we're restless until we rest with God. And maybe that's part of the answer as to where God is. God's our home, even in the midst of struggle, grief, hardship, and even this situation that we find ourselves in as a world. All right, friends. Well, heavy stuff. I know that. And you did a great job. There's Sandy adding one more comment there. Agree much that God grieves with us and cries with us, right? And also celebrates with us. So, again, it's the God who is with us in the midst of all of that I think can have a lot of power for us. Hey, I don't know if you've had any time to work with disciplines in the back. I know we've got a lot on our minds and lots of things to try to be thinking through and figuring out. But back at page 121 starts the practice of disciplines for this week. And once more, Junius turns to something that seems to be a very strong theme for him, that worship can be and is for him a way of resetting one's soul and working through particularly a season of grief and loss. And worship, is that turning toward God. But there is a phrase I wanted to lift up just to kind of give you something to think about as we end on page 121. It's his second sentence in this little chapter here at the end. The practice of worship. He says, worship is a lifestyle. So I want you to think about that. Could it be that worship isn't where you go for an hour on Sunday morning? Worship's not something that we do with others. Worship's not like what we're trying to do now online. I mean, that is worship, but it's not the only thing worship is. Worship is a lifestyle. It's a way of being. It's a way of living. It's an orientation in life. And if it's true that worship becomes our expression of blessing to God, which is one way to understand it, then what we're saying when we say worship is a lifestyle is that in every aspect of our life, in all that we do, in all that we are, in everything we have and everything we hope for, we live that in such a way that it becomes an offering and a blessing to God. It is worship-filled and worshipful. And all of that is for the glory of God. So think about that. He gives us some ways each day to begin to experiment with what that could mean for us to live worship. And not just to have that be something that is a thing we do or a place we go every once in a great while. But it becomes us and the way that we live. All right. Let's end it there. Hey, we're on session 5. That means we've got one more session right in the smack dab middle of Holy Week. And again, I'll send a link. As many of you that can join us live, gosh, how rich this makes the experience to have you participating in this way. And we're grateful for that. Thank you for that. For now, I'm going to sign off and thank you again for your participation. A couple of things I want to remind you of. One, I sent in my email reminder to you, also I put in there, if you read down away, that I'm asking this group of us who are watching this, if you've got a cross in your home that's displayed somewhere, if you would take a picture of that and send it to me. I got an idea for Good Friday for our worship on that evening, and those cross images, I'd like to figure out a way to use them. So would you please, if you have not yet responded to me and you've got a cross and you can take a picture with your cell phone. And by the way, when you take it with the cell phone, if you take it landscape-wise instead of like this, instead of vertical, that makes it so much easier as we try to work with that image. But I'd love to have some more pictures of the cross. I may not be able to use all of them, but I'd like to have you submit one that we might be able to use. So I wanted to throw that out there as we end. Again, thank you, everybody. You take care, and for now, I'll say good night and God bless. Bye-bye.